Yeah. So it's going now. It's going now. Okay, today we're going to do a pillow, but it's got curves. It's got curves around here, so it's a little bit different. And this pattern is a little bit different. This is tissue paper, and when you buy a pattern, this is what it looks like. So again, we go to Closet 4 and we find our fabric. This is the right side of the fabric. If you were wearing this, that's what you would have towards you. This is the wrong side of the fabric, and it would be what's against your body if you were making a shirt. And now this is we're going to talk about something different. This is what's called the selvage. And if you can see, it's just white and there's little bitty holes in here. There's also a selvage here. So these are the edges of the fabric. And when we make garments, we make them so the threads that are the selvage goes up and down on a garment. So these are the lengthwise threads because they're parallel to the selvage. These are the crosswise threads because they're crossing the selvage. So you see on our pattern here, it's got this big grain line arrow. We want this grain line arrow to be parallel to the selvage. So, and the reason for this is so it's cut on grain. If it's cut off grain, it doesn't hang right. It pulls out of shape. So this would not be correct. The grain line is here, and here's my selvage. We want it so it's parallel. And remember from math, parallel is when you have two lines. My fingers are parallel to each other. Perpendicular is like this. So we want to do that. And again, we're going to get the pins from Closet 2, and we're going to pin this down. We're going to cut it out. Notice how I folded the fabric over so I didn't waste a whole bunch. This one you have to be a little careful with because the tissue paper can tear pretty easily. So I'm pinning this all the way around. Push down, push up. It feels like you're scratching the table. And again, don't feel like you have to pin this fast. Take your time, do a good job. We want to be accurate and do a good job rather than make 100 pillows. Okay, this is going to be a flower, by the way. It's a flower pillow. Okay, so we've got that done. Again, go to Closet 2, find a good pair of scissors. If you don't have a good pair of scissors, test it out, make sure they're nice. Now when you're cutting this, you're still going to cut along the edge, like this. You need to be a little bit more, you need to go a little bit more slower because it's curved edges. And if you don't cut this correctly, I'm going to cut that off. If you don't cut this correctly, your project is not going to look right. And again, if you don't sew this correctly, your project's not going to look right. And I don't know if you can see this, but it says 1/2 inch seam allowance. So instead of sewing edge of presser foot with edge of fabric, we're going to do 1/2 inch. That's a little bit different. So I'll show you what that means when we get finished cutting here. Okay, I'm all cut. This can be thrown away. The extra fabric that you have, just put in the middle of the round table and I'll take care of it later. So we're going to take the pins out, and then we're going to pin it together again. And again, you might say, why do we have to do this? And the reason you pin it together before you sew it, I just ripped part of my pattern. If you do that, let me know, and I will go back and I will fix it. So later on, I will have to tape that together. So we're going to pin this all the way around. And then the reason we're doing this is because if we just sat down and sewed it, the feed dog would push the bottom one out faster and you would not have the edges even. So when we get done with this, we're going to sew it. Now this is mainly green, so I would use green on this. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different color just so that you can see what I'm doing. But if this was a pillow that you were making, you would be expected to use green thread. Okay, and now we're going to have to leave an opening for stuffing. And that's kind of tricky with curved edges. If you can, always leave a straight line open, but there's just no straight lines in this. So we're going to put 2 pins here, and we're going to put 2 pins here, and that means we're going to leave that open. Okay, pause. Okay. We're at the sewing machine. You might notice this is pink thread, but I want to sew it in pink, not because there's a little bit of pink here, but so that while it's being videotaped, you can see it a lot better. Now usually you go edge of presser foot with edge of fabric. With this one we're going to do a 1/2 inch. And if you come over here, you can see there's 3 lines. There's this line, and this line. The first line, if you put the fabric along the first line, that's the 3/8 line. This is the 4/8 line. This is the 5/8 line. So a 1/2 inch would be 4/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the fabric along the 4/8 line, which is a 1/2 inch, needle down, presser foot down, forward, backward. And by the way, when you go over to the machine, this should be on 0, this should be on 0, this should be on 0, and this should be on 2.5. If that isn't, change it. 0, 0, 0, 2.5. This is the length of your stitch. This is the width of your stitch. This makes a zigzag, and this is a buttonhole thing, which we don't use very much. So as I'm sewing this, my eyes are along the 5/8 line, or the 4/8 line, and I have to go a little bit slower than I did before. Because this is a little trickier because it's got so many curves. It's just like driving a car. If you are going around a curve, you need to go a little bit slower. And again, I should be using green thread, but I'm hoping that this will show up what I'm doing. I'm hoping that pink will show up so that you can see it better. Notice my edges are together. You don't want to have something like this. You don't want to have it like that. Some kids will just, well, we'll just cut that off. Well, they do. They cut that off, and then what happens when they finish their pillow, it's distorted. Their pillow doesn't look right, and they say, my pillow doesn't look right. What's wrong? Your pattern's wrong. They always blame it on my pattern. So notice I'm taking the pins out as I go. And I'm coming up to my 2 pins. So I'm going to backstitch here. Raise the needle to the highest point, raise the presser foot, pull this out, cut. Just stay there. Just can you pause it? Will it pause? Okay, the next step what we're going to do is make clips. And when you make clips, you take scissors and you go like this. And everybody says, well, why do we have to make clips? And I just want to show you really quick why we have to make clips. I'm going to turn this around. And again, turn it around like you turn your socks around. And without making clips, it's going to be all puckery. So a lot of times people will come over and they'll say, why is it all puckery? And so here it should lay down really nice, and it's not. None of this is laying down very nice. So I'm going to turn it around again, and I'm going to make clips. And if you're doing things like a letter, like the letter A or the letter B, you definitely have to make clips. If you're making a heart, anything with curved lines, you need to make clips. So what that means, again, is I take my scissors and I just make little cuts. Now, what do you suppose you need to be careful with? You need to be careful that you aren't going to cut through the sewing line. You would not want to go like this because you could slip. So I'm going this all the way around. It takes a little bit of time, but you get credits for all the time that you're working on your project. And you may not be able to go this fast. That's okay. My hand's getting tired. I would, if I wasn't videotaping this, I would take a little break and rest my hand. Okay, now I'm going to turn it around, push it all out, and it should have a nice little curved edge to it. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go press, then we're going to stuff it, and then we're going to sew the opening up. And we don't want this folded over like this. We want all this to be pulled out. Okay, it's starting to look like something, but it's still not finished. Okay, we're going to go press. Okay, we're at the sewing machine, or at the ironing board, and what I want to do is press this down so it looks nice. Make sure you pull this edge out, and then press. And make sure the iron should be on 3. you don't want it too hot. If you have it too hot, it will scorch or burn the fabric, and then you'll have a big brown spot on that. So pull this out, press. Do you see how I've got the shape? There's the shape of my flower. That's what we want. We want a nice shape. And if you don't sew straight, you wouldn't have this shape. It would just be distorted. Now here's maybe the tricky part, is when we come to the opening. If I just fold over the opening like this, it's going to be straight. And see how it doesn't look right? Because I've got all these curves, and then I fold this over and it's a straight line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this over 1/2 inch. And I'm going to press this side. And you can tell what 1/2 inch is because that's what you've sewed. So I've pressed this edge over 1/2 inch. Then I'm going to flip this over and see how that's all folded over. We don't want that. We want it to be 1/2 inch, which we just got through doing. And if you're not quite sure, you can always get a ruler and measure. Okay, see how much nicer that edge looks? What we're going to do now is we're going to stuff it, and I'm just going to go over to the sewing machine. Okay, we're at the sewing machine. Now, I'm not going to stuff this just to save time because you should know how to stuff by now. So we're just going to sew this up. We're going to pretend that it's already been stuffed. See how nice and curved that edge is, and see how nice and curved those edges are? Okay, so what we would use green thread, but the reason I'm using pink is so that you can see what I'm doing. So we're going to start here, and normally we would go edge of presser foot with edge of fabric, but what we're going to do here is we're going to take this edge here, line this up, needle down, presser foot down, just barely backstitch, just a couple stitches backstitch. And then I'm lining, my eyes are right there, and I'm lining that up. And I'm turning notice how slow I'm going. I'm going very slow, and I'm sewing that. And I think this is the end. Okay, now if I would make a mistake, what we would do is we would just stop, and we would take that out and then redo it. Go ahead and clip this off, and then you would cut these threads off. Then you would take it to the teacher and get credits, and you have a really nice pillow. But if you make a mistake doing this, don't just go over it and over it and over it and over it and over it. We would rip this out, and then we would redo it again. Sometimes I'll have students that go over it 4 or 5 times, and it's impossible to rip off, and it looks really messy.